Some things don't fit, like the Apple and Android charger. We all know that one. Or like the red and black line of a jump leads. I hope I don't know that one. Or I asked my wife for an example of something that doesn't fit the other day, and without thinking, she said, my mustache. Harsh. But there are some things that if you put them together, they really don't go, and will actually cause you a lot of damage, like the jump leads. Tonight we're going to see that Christianity does not fit with certain things. You cannot make it fit, and if you do, you'll actually make things worse. False You Go Good News for Armagh. This is the podcast that looks at the big questions of the universe and of our hearts. We're reading through Mark's Gospel together, and so we come to chapter 2 and verses 18 to 22. Let's just read them together. Now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting, and people came and said to him, why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? And Jesus said to them, can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken away from them, and then they will fast in that day. No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth on an old garment. If he does, the patch tears away from it, the new from the old, and a worse tear is made. No one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins. Now, Mark's Gospel, we've been saying every week, is the record of the life of Jesus, by which he explains the gospel, the good news of what he has come to bring to us. And so now we come to chapter 2, verses 18 to 22, and we're in the third paragraph in this new movement. We've turned from sin and sinners, remember, in our two previous scenes. That which tells us who we are and what we do wrong. Mark turns to fasting and Sabbath in the next two scenes, what we don't do. So what we do to what we don't do. So the absence of food and fasting, the cessation of work in the Sabbath. And here we come to two things that are pretty common to us: religious practice and religious occasions. Now, the other thing to notice, just by way of introduction, is that there's growing opposition to Jesus. And Mark is building the tension by giving us our third why question. And this is going to climax in chapter 3, verse 6, where the Pharisees are going to gang up with the Herodians to seek to destroy Jesus himself. This week, in this passage, all I want to do is show you two things. Number one, that the gospel does not fit with what I'll call tradition. And number two, that the gospel fits with Jesus. So firstly then, the gospel does not fit with tradition. Let's get a hold of this question that is being asked, because this is the key to understanding the text. Verse 18 says again, now John's disciples and the Pharisees were fasting. And people come up and said to him, why do John's disciples and the disciples of the Pharisees fast, but your disciples do not fast? So this is our question. It's about fasting. The whole thing is about fasting. Now fasting, as I'm sure you might be aware, is the abstaining of something. So we've just hit Lent, 40 days, where a lot of the church will abstain from something. It's usually food. And biblical fasting is not to gain or get anything from God. We don't use it as a trinket. But usually it's done to spend time with the Lord. And so here we have two groups of people that are asking about fasting. So John's disciples, that's John the Baptist, who we met earlier in chapter 1, who prepared the way of the Lord. And then the Pharisees, who continue to hound and follow the Lord here, are asking about this issue, this tradition of fasting. Now, in the Bible, in the Old Testament, there was only one place, and I'll say this again, there was only one place where fasting was mandated, commanded. And that was in a special day for the nation, the Day of Atonement. And in this context, it was to give time to contemplate their sin in preparation to confess and atone it, as the nation would have had to do every year. But what happens throughout the rest of the Bible is that you see people spontaneously fast. They do this out of contrition or out of penitence, for example in Jonah 3 or in Esther 3. Or sometimes in Samuel you'll see it as mourning or self-humiliation or denial before God. But off the back of this spontaneity, off the back of this one command, traditions sprung up, extra to the Bible. So in the book, in a prophet towards the end of the Old Testament, Zechariah, where you see fasts in the 4th, the 5th, the 7th and the 10th month of the year. And by the time the Pharisees came to prominence, 100 BC and into Jesus' day, this had become twice a week. So on Mondays and on Thursdays they fast. On Monday, because that was apparently the day that Moses went up the mountain to receive the law. Thursdays, whenever Moses came down from receiving the law. And there's a text in Luke chapter 18 that talks about the Pharisees actually talking, and he says, he makes this his boast. I fast twice a week. So notice what's happened. What was commanded once had become a tradition and has now become a religious law. Now, take a side step or take a sideward step for a second. Not all traditions are wrong. And Jesus actually, in his teaching and fasting in Matthew's Gospel, in Matthew 6, he doesn't actually tell them to stop it. He tells them to regulate it. How you do it is as important as you're doing it. So whenever you fast, don't do it openly. Go into your closet. It's between you and the Lord. And so the first thing I'll say is not all traditions are bad. So like, for example, in a lot of churches, we have a tradition of the times that we meet. I think that's a healthy tradition. But what is being preached against is the assumption that that is the only time to meet. You see the difference? Traditions aren't bad, but it's how they're handled. Now, the problem here with fasting is that the assumed practice had become a standard of orthodoxy. So what was a religious tradition, something extra to the Bible, had now become a law. And this is emphasized actually in how it's brought up. It's not the Torah taught us to fast, so why don't your disciples do it? No, it's John's disciples and the Pharisees. They are asking, why do you not do it? And this is a tradition, something that is extra to the Bible, that has become a practice that isn't really that bad, but has become a standard of orthodoxy. It's a litmus test for what's real. And that's wrong. And just to update this into our time, this happens quite a lot, I think, in the church. It's not wrong that the church has brought on different traditions, for example, like I said, at the time and stuff. But sometimes what is taught in the Bible, what is actually good in the Bible, is over time changed into something, just like fasting did. It grows into a new kind of animal, and it actually becomes a litmus test for orthodoxy and for salvation itself. Can I give you 3 examples? Firstly, think about baptism. And I'll challenge you, if you disagree with me on this, do this. Read through the New Testament. And tell me, if you were to forget everything that you know about baptism, if you just read the New Testament, what would you think baptism is? I guarantee you would walk away thinking that baptism is just a symbol. It's just a symbol. It's a symbol of a new life. It's a symbol about what has already happened. And so, it's a symbol that is always done after belief. So a person comes to believe in Jesus and then they're baptized. And then not only that, it's a symbol done after belief, but it's also done by immersion in water. But over time, this has become infant baptism that has actually been welded on to the church and to salvation itself. You take, for example, something like the Lord's Supper. You read the Lord's Supper, and just read it for yourself, like read 1 Corinthians 11 yourself. And you walk away thinking, what is the Lord's Supper? I guarantee you won't think what it has become. In some quarters, the Lord's Supper has become peculiar, has become something necessary, has become something that's welded onto salvation. It's become something mystical as well, probably what it was never meant to be. And I'm not saying that God's presence doesn't come near whenever we celebrate the Lord's Supper, but the actual bread and wine themselves are bread and wine. And you read the New Testament and that's all that you would get. But you go forward a couple of 100 years, couple of 1,000 years actually, and you see that the Lord's Supper has become something different. Something that's now required for salvation itself, when it was never meant like that in the New Testament. And let's go to the third thing, baptism, Lord's Supper, but salvation itself. You see that if you read the New Testament again, you will come away thinking that salvation is by faith alone. But enter lots of years, lots of theologians, lots of different things that are added on, and you see that salvation becomes part of joining the church. I am part of the church, so I'm saved. Like, where is that in the New Testament? In the New Testament, it tells you the opposite, that a person is saved by faith alone in what Christ has done, and then they become part of the church. It's not the other way around. Salvation is not brought to us via the church, but it's the other way around. And can I just say that probably one of the beliefs in our modern church that shows us this the most, and I don't want to offend anybody, but I want to get people thinking, but it's the doctrine of the Immaculate Conception. And that is the belief that the Virgin Mary was free of original sin from the moment of her conception. Because the thought is, the extra thought to the Bible, that's not like this thought doesn't come out in the Bible at all, but the extra thought in the Bible is, how can the Holy Child Jesus live in a sinful environment? But if you if we have learned anything from Mark's Gospel, it is that whatever Jesus touches, for example, the leper or the demonized person, they're made clean. And it's his presence that makes things clean. God doesn't need our extra teachings that can have a harmful effect of elevating normal humans and actually damaging the gospel. No doubt Mary is blessed among all ladies. No problem with that. Given birth to the Messiah, surely she's blessed above all ladies. But she's still a lady. But what has worried me is that she is sometimes elevated in certain churches to a level that's not in the Bible. Can you see the danger of the extra biblical traditions? And it doesn't fit with the good news. So that, to go back to baptism, for example, if the good news is telling us that we need to trust, we need to believe, how can baptism as an infant fit with that? So the doctrine of washing away original sin, being baptized into the church, how does that square with a child believing? It doesn't, it can't. And it actually makes things worse, because people can think that they're right with God when they're not. In this series, what we're trying to do is we're trying to let the Bible speak for itself. We're trying to get back to the Bible, and all we're doing is reading, explaining, and applying. Traditions do not fit with the gospel, with the good news of Jesus. Jesus then answers these people. And we see firstly a negative answer, what the gospel is not, and then secondly a positive answer, what the gospel is. So verse 21, he says this: "No one sews a piece of unshrunk cloth onto an old garment. If he does, the patch tears away from it, and new from the old, and a worse tear is made. No one puts new wine into old wineskins. If he does, the wine will burst the skins, and the wine is destroyed, and so are the skins. But new wine is for fresh wineskins." In answering these men, he tells two parables, one about clothes and one about wineskins. And you'll never repair an old garment with a new piece of cloth. Like that's just a standard, that's knowledge. For when washed, the new will rip away from the old, and it will be destroyed. You will never put new wine into an old wineskin, because the wine will ferment, expand, and it needs that little bit of give that a new wineskin will. But the old doesn't. It doesn't have this ability, and it will burst open, destroying both wine and the skins. The two don't fit. The two don't go together. This tradition does not fit with the gospel. The way they were using fasting does not fit with the gospel. That's what the Lord is saying. You guys are putting this extra thing in, and you are saying that this is necessary for salvation, necessary for enjoying the Lord, and it doesn't fit with the message that I'm bringing. So, What is the message that Jesus is bringing? And this is our second point. The gospel fits with Jesus. We've seen how it doesn't fit with tradition and how these men were using fasting. But now I want to show you how the gospel fits with Jesus. And this passage will show us three things. Number one, who Jesus is. Notice verse 19. Jesus said to them, "Can the wedding guests fast while the bridegroom is with them? As long as they have the bridegroom with them, they cannot fast. The days will come when the bridegroom is taken from them, and they will fast in that day." Mark says they cannot fast while Jesus is with them. Notice that expression, with them. Because Jesus' presence here with them, it's not a feast, it's not a funeral, it's a feast. And he does actually say that one day they will see a tomb, and in that day they will mourn, but not now. To fast in the presence of Jesus would be unthinkable, because it's a wedding, the bridegroom. It's a wedding whenever he is about. So that you imagine meeting your hero, and you imagine being in their presence, like you imagine meeting Messi or Johnny Sexton, and being in their presence and being miserable. You would never think about it. But like you think of being in the presence of Jesus, and Mark has already told us who he is. In chapter 2, he's proved that he is the Son of Man. He is the great physician. He is the cleanser of lepers and demons in chapter 1. And in the introduction, remember, the Father said, "This is my Son." And Jesus being with them now should be the centre and focus and source of their joy if they understood who he was. Mark actually says, or Jesus says, that they cannot fast. It is impossible that a person would fast in the presence of Jesus. The only real response to the realization of who he is feast and gladness. And so the application is, who do you think Jesus is? You know, we might say he's the Son of God, and it might roll off our lips, but do we believe that? To understand this good news, we have to come to see who Jesus is. It's all about him. And I'm hoping maybe the penny might drop with you today, that you might think, and you might see that he is the divine Son, and in seeing him that you might experience this joy. But Jesus doesn't just tell us who he is, he tells us what he has come to do. And the Lord refers to a time when he is taken away. You notice that expression, when he is taken away. Removed by force is the idea. And then in that day, they will know the meaning of sorrow. And this is an allusion to Jesus' passion. And I maybe might not have understood this until afterwards, but it's enhanced in the text. The days, plural, you will enjoy. There will be a feast, but there's a day. In that day you shall fast. So Isaiah 53 verse 8, written 700 years before Jesus, says this: by oppression and judgment, talking about the Messiah, it says, by oppression and judgment, he was taken away. By humiliation, mistreatment, and false trial, Isaiah says he was taken away. How awful a fate, how dreadful an ending. And this is talking about the cross where Jesus would suffer for our sins. But the prophet, he said one time that weeping comes for the night and joy comes in the morning. And it's an interesting thing that the early church did not think of Jesus being away from them, but as living in their midst. What happened? Jesus died. That day was horrendous. But he rose, he appeared, he ascended, and he has sent the Holy Spirit who brought his presence. You see, Jesus has died for our sin. He has risen to prove it, and he offers us a new thing, nothing to do with traditions. And I'll tell you, some of you hate the traditions of the church, the man-made extras in the church. This should excite you, because it means that the gospel is nothing about those traditions, but it's simply about, number one, who he is, and his presence brings joy. But number two, what he has done. He was taken away. And what this brings, who he is and what he has done, brings a new thing. And this is the point. And he's going to tell us three new things that the gospel brings us. Three new things that in Jesus, in his person as Son of God, and in his work at Calvary's cross, an empty tomb, brings us. Number one, it brings us a new relationship. The Bible is audacious in its claim to what Christianity is. And a lot of people don't get this. The Bible claims that Christianity is a relationship with the Creator. Not just any kind of relationship, like a kind of a far-off friend or acquaintance or a servant. Sometimes that language is used. But there's intimate language used. This is Isaiah 54, verse 5. It says this, "For your Maker is your husband. The Lord of hosts is his name." Your Maker is your husband. Like, this is Jehovah, this is God speaking. And as Maker, he wants this most intimate, close, personal association with us. And here, you'll notice 3 times over, Jesus calls himself the bridegroom. Well, who's his bride? Well, the church is said to be his bride. Jesus is gaining a bride, gaining a love relationship with his church. Now, if you think about that relationship, and if you think about what they were doing in fasting, the two are just so far removed. What fasting was to these Pharisees was a way to earn, a way to gain favour, a way to gain acceptance with God. They were earning their relationship with God, their servanthood of God or something. But Jesus says it's not about that. Jesus says it's about a relationship. Now, you imagine someone proposing to you. And you imagine them saying, right, listen, I've got you a present. I've got you a cookbook. And I've underlined, 7 or 8 recipes. And if you cook them for me, then I will take you as my partner in life. Can you imagine that? Or imagine them saying, listen, I got you a present. I got you this broom and this mop. And if you clean for me, I will love you in life. And I will commit myself to you. I hope if anyone ever comes and makes a proposal like that to you, you will say no. You will run from it, because that's not what a relationship is. Now, the person in a marriage might cook for the other and might enjoy it. They might clean for the other and they might enjoy it. But that's not a relationship is. It's not about earning. Love is not earned. A relationship is not a distant thing. And Christianity is seen as a marriage between us and our God. That he says, come to me, and let me wed you. And it's just a powerful thing. And Jesus says that he is the bridegroom. Firstly, there's a new relationship, and that blows fasting and what they were thinking about fasting out of the water. Can you see how that just doesn't fit? Secondly, there's a new covering. And remember the parable. Jesus is bringing a garment. Their garment, mixed with tradition, broke apart. There were holes in it. But Jesus says that there's a new garment, a new covering. And I guess that this is what happens at weddings. We go and we get new garments. We get new clothes. The Bible actually uses this idea of garment as an analogy, as a parable, as a picture. And a lot of the time it's talked about as a garment of righteousness. So a very famous verse, it comes from 2 Corinthians 5 verse 21. This is what it says. St. Paul is talking. He says this. He was made sin for us. It's talking about Jesus at Calvary's cross, that he bore our punishment, took our sin. Goes on to say, he was made sin for us who knew no sin. Like, that is astounding. Like Jesus, he didn't do anything wrong, but yet he went through that for us. But he did it for a purpose. So he was made sin for us who knew no sin, that we might be made the righteousness of God in him. Do you hear that? That we might be made the righteousness of God in him. That is, that we would be given a garment of righteousness. You see, Jesus died our death, took our punishment, but more than that, he gives us a record of perfect law keeping. When we acknowledge our sin, when we ask him to save us, it's like the Father puts on us a new garment that you cannot see our sin past. And notice this, it's not earned by religious ordinances like fasting. It's not worked for by penance or flagellation of the body, as Colossians will talk about. It's what one man has called the great exchange. Christ died our death, took our sin, our punishment, but when we trust him, he gives us his record of righteousness as a new garment with no holes and no patchwork needed. And so whenever you see Romans chapter 5, you see this, that Adam brought sin, Christ brings righteousness. Adam brought death, Christ brings life. When you see Revelation 7, that they're there in heaven. Why? Because they're clothed in garments, fresh linen, pure linen. And it's a very sobering thing that Jesus tells a parable that has the opposite point of view. In Matthew 22, he tells the parable of a wedding feast. And there the garments are given out by the host, and everyone's dressed appropriately in robes of righteousness. But there's one guy, and he's not dressed. And what Jesus actually says is that guy will be cast out to a place where there'll be weeping and gnashing of teeth. And the point is that Jesus offers you a new garment. He offers you a robe of righteousness. And this guy didn't take it. And all that's left for him is to be cast into hell, where there's weeping, where there's crying, and there's gnashing of teeth, that he's angry. God doesn't want that for you, neither do I. Come and trust the Lord Jesus and know this new covering and know this new relationship. But also, thirdly, know this new joy. And that's what the whole thing's about. That whenever we're about Jesus, that there's a feasting, not a fasting. That there's a festival, not a funeral. And it's not based on the absence of things. You know, I became a Christian when I was 19, at a point in my life when I was utterly dry. And as I say these words, let them ring in you and in your ears and in your hearts. Like, do you want this? Like, contentment, satisfaction, assurance, hope, purpose. Like, these are the things that genuinely Jesus offers, and in getting these things and receiving him into our lives, they change us and they give us firm joy in life. You know, whenever I was 19, I realized that I didn't have any of these things. And I kind of likened to myself. I didn't know it at the time. I didn't have the words to articulate it, you know what I mean? But imagine, like, you're standing at the side of a lake and there's fish under the water. And one of the fish under the water, we call him Trevor the trout, and he's swimming about and he bumps into a guy called Sammy the salmon, and they're chatting. And Trevor says to Sammy, do you ever just get sick of all this water, all this darkness down here, all the coldness? Would you not want to just go up on land and kick a football? Would you not just want to do that? And Sammy says, no, Trevor, don't do it. If it'll not work out for you, it'll be bad if you do it. And Trevor says, stuff you, Sammy. And what he does is he flops out onto the bank. What happens is he dies. Why? Because he wasn't made for dry land. You see, Trevor actually was frustrated that day, but he gained life through the water. That's like, in the water, Trevor was alive. And there was a Bible verse that came to me at that time. In me, in Christ, living in relationship with Christ is life. And as I finish this podcast, I want you to know that there's a new joy. Freedom to be honest in God's presence, a joy to be saved from wrath to come, a joy of knowing a new relationship, a new covering. And as I finish this, what is Christianity to you? Is it distant? Is it something that you just do? Like, do you have an assurance of your sins being completely covered? Or are there wee holes or wee gaps that you're worried about? Do you enjoy your faith in God? Like, if you're answering no to these questions, it's likely that you're not a real Christian. The gospel is not a funeral march of sober fasting and religious ordinance. It is a wedding feast that you're invited to for new relationship, new clothes of righteousness, and new joy. Christ was taken away that we might be brought into a marriage. Christ went into sorrow that we might have joy. Christ was stripped naked that we might have a new covering in righteousness. This is the good news that fits into our intuition, fits into life, and fits into heaven. And I hope that you will find new life, a new relationship, and new joy in Him. Thanks for joining me today on Good News for Armagh. I'd love to hear your thoughts or your questions. Feel free to reach out to us. Until next time, Slán, go fóill.